There are those moments in life when the distance between defeat and victory seems almost impossible to cross. Moments when you look around and you realize everyone else appears to be ahead of you, ahead financially, ahead emotionally, ahead spiritually, ahead professionally. And somewhere inside the silence of your own thoughts, you begin believing the lie that maybe the race has already been decided. But every once in a while, life gives us a reminder that the race is not always won at the first turn, that sometimes the one buried deep in the back of the pack becomes the one wearing the roses. And this past week, in the 152nd running of the Kentucky Derby at Churchill Downs, a horse named Golden Tempo reminded the world of something we desperately need to remember. Stay with me. Coming to you from the MAB Podcast Network, this is On the Brink with Michael Allen Brown. Welcome, friends, to On the Brink. I'm Michael Allen Brown. Tonight, we talk about hope. Not the shallow kind of hope printed on coffee mugs or stitched into motivational pillows. I'm speaking of the kind of hope that survives disappointment, the kind that keeps moving while everyone else is already celebrating someone else's victory. Because in this year's Kentucky Derby, the story wasn't merely about a horse crossing a finish line. It was about persistence, position, patience, and the shocking possibility that where you are now may not determine where you finish. The great races at Churchill Downs have always carried drama, mud, thunder, nerves, silk hats flashing beneath the gray spring skies. But this race carried something else. Golden Tempo was not expected to dominate, not expected to become the headline. And yet, somewhere during that race, while others exhausted themselves battling for early position, Golden Tempo waited, steadied, endured. And then came the move. That incredible move from behind. The kind that leaves spectators standing in disbelief. You know, life has a cruel way of convincing people that being behind means being finished. Some listening tonight know exactly what I mean. You're starting over. You're grieving. You're fighting anxiety. You're watching younger people sprint past you while wondering if your own best days have disappeared somewhere years ago. And if we're honest, those are moments when the rear of the pack feels awfully lonely. And here's the lesson of Golden Tempo. The back of the pack is not the end of the race. Sometimes it is merely the place where endurance is being formed. Sometimes the leaders burn themselves out trying to impress the crowd. Sometimes noise disguises weakness. Sometimes speed disguises instability. And sometimes the quiet horse nobody notices still has strength left for the final stretch. I've lived long enough to discover something important. God often does his deepest work in hidden places. David was forgotten in the fields before becoming king. Moses spent years in the wilderness before leadership found him. Abraham Lincoln lost election after election before history remembered his name. And many of the people who ultimately shaped this world spent long seasons feeling invisible. Maybe that's where some of you are tonight. Invisible, overlooked, buried in the mud or back of life's lineup. You watch others celebrated while your own story feels stalled at the gate. But what if your pace is different for a reason? What if you're being preserved instead of delayed? The Derby teaches another lesson. A race can change suddenly. One opening, one lane, one decision, one final push, and everything changes. People who had already written the story suddenly realize they were reading the wrong script. There is another truth hidden inside horse racing. The horse does not always determine the weather. It runs anyway. Rain falls anyway. Mud splashes anyway. Visibility disappears anyway. And yet, the race continues. That sounds a lot like life, doesn't it? You don't get to choose all of your conditions. Some of you are running in mud right now. Health concerns, financial pressure, family heartache, loneliness, fear, anxiety that creeps in at 3 o'clock in the morning when the world is asleep. And still, the race continues. What impressed me most about this Derby victory was not merely speed. It was timing. Golden Tempo did not panic because others surged ahead early. And there is wisdom in that. Panic has destroyed many people. People panic in marriages, panic in business, panic in markets, panic in faith. Panic causes people to abandon their lane before their moment arrives. Perhaps one of the hardest disciplines in life is learning to trust timing. You do not always fully understand, but to keep moving without applause, to keep preparing without recognition, to keep believing when visible evidence says otherwise. Tonight's episode of On the Brink is brought to you by our friends at Hedgehog Signs. If your business, organization, campaign, or event needs professional signage, banners, wraps, promotional materials, or custom printing, Hedgehog Signs has become a trusted regional name for quality work and personal service. Owner Jim Claypool and his team print on site with attention to detail that's increasingly rare these days. And listeners of On the Brink receive 10% off campaign products by mentioning the code word BRINK. Call 859-291-8544 or visit Hedgehog Signs. Our thanks to Hedgehog Signs for supporting independent conversation. The older I become, the more I realize life is not merely about winning. It's about finishing with integrity. Some horses lead early and disappear. Some people gain quick fame and lose themselves. Some become consumed with being noticed instead of becoming meaningful. But the truly remarkable stories often emerge later, steadier, wiser, tempered by hardship. And perhaps that is why this derby resonated with so many people. Because deep inside every human being, there is a longing to believe comeback stories are still possible, that lost ground can be recovered, that exhaustion is not permanent, that disappointment is not destiny, that being behind today does not mean remaining behind forever. The crowd usually watches the front, but history often remembers the finish. There are people listening tonight who have spent years discouraged because the spotlight never found them. Maybe you raised children faithfully while nobody applauded. Maybe you worked ordinary jobs with extraordinary character. Maybe you quietly carried burdens nobody ever saw. Do not underestimate, though, quiet faithfulness. The world desperately needs people who continue running with dignity, even when cameras are pointed the other way. The Kentucky Derby only lasts minutes. Life lasts much longer. And unlike horse racing, our greatest victories are not always public. Sometimes victory is surviving. Sometimes victory is forgiveness. Sometimes victory is getting out of bed one more morning when grief told you not to. Sometimes victory is choosing kindness in a hateful world. Sometimes victory is refusing to surrender your soul to bitterness. So tonight, if you find yourself near the rear of the pack, hear me clearly. Do not quit in the middle of the race. Do not measure your future solely by your current position. Do not assume silence means absence of purpose. And never forget, some of the most extraordinary finishes in history began with someone nearly counted out. This has been On the Brink with Michael Allen Brown. And perhaps tonight's lesson from Churchill Downs is much more simple than we imagined. The race is not always won by the one who starts strongest, but often by the one who still has heart left in the final stretch. And somewhere out there tonight, someone listening needed to hear this. Until next time, keep your eyes on the horizon. Keep your courage intact. And remember, even from the back of the pack, miracles still do run.